The metal felt heavier in my hands than it had 20 years ago. Cold brass tarnished at the edges with a faded ribbon that had once been crimson red. The inscription read, "For valor and sacrifice." I traced the engraved letters with my arthritic fingers, remembering the day they'd placed it in my trembling hands while my children stood beside me in their black funeral clothes, too young to understand that their father was never coming home. I was 67 now, and the truth had finally found me. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that tricks you into believing life is predictable and safe. My daughter Sarah had called that morning, her voice strange and tight, asking if she and her brother Michael could come over. "It's important, Mom," she'd said. "We need to talk." Now they sat across from me in my living room, these middle-aged strangers who had once been my babies. Sarah's face was pale, drawn with an emotion I couldn't name. Michael couldn't meet my eyes. Between them on the coffee table lay a manila folder, thick with papers that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice cracking like thin ice. "We found something. Something about Dad." For 20 years, I had lived with the story of my husband's death like a sacred text written on my heart. Thomas Hartford, decorated officer, beloved husband, devoted father. Killed in the line of duty during what they'd called a routine operation gone wrong. He'd died saving his team, they told me. He'd thrown himself on danger without hesitation. A hero's death. A warrior's end. I had built my entire widowhood on that foundation. Every lonely night, every milestone he'd missed. Every tear I'd wiped from our children's faces, all of it made bearable by the knowledge that he'd died for something noble. Something that mattered. "What did you find?" My voice sounded hollow, as if it came from somewhere far away. Michael finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked so much like his father it made my chest ache. "We hired a private investigator," he said quietly, "for your birthday. We wanted to trace Dad's service record, maybe find some of his old unit members, get some stories about him that we'd never heard." Sarah's hand trembled as she opened the folder. "We thought it would be a gift, a way to honor him, to help you feel closer to him." Instead, Michael continued, his jaw clenched. "We uncovered something else entirely." The first document Sarah slid across the table was a classified report, marked with official seals and stamped declassified in red ink. My reading glasses sat on the chain around my neck, but my hands shook too badly to put them on. Sarah leaned forward and began to read. Operation Nightfall. Subject, Thomas Hartford. Status, discharged. Cause gross misconduct and criminal negligence resulting in civilian casualties. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt the room tilt, felt my carefully constructed world begin to crack and splinter. "Keep reading," Michael said, his voice hard with an anger I'd never heard from him before. Sarah's voice broke as she continued. During an unauthorized raid on a suspected weapons facility, Officer Hartford ordered an assault on a civilian compound. Intelligence reports had warned the location was a school and residential building. Hartford proceeded despite explicit orders to abort the mission. I couldn't breathe. The metal in my lap felt like it was burning through my dress. 17 people died, Mom. Sarah's tears fell onto the papers, smudging the typewritten words. 12 of them were children. The youngest was 4 years old. "Oh," I whispered. "No, that's not possible. They made a mistake. Your father would never. There's more." Michael's voice was ice. He pulled out a photograph, grainy and faded, but clear enough. It showed Thomas standing in front of a burning building, his face twisted in an expression I'd never seen. Cold, hard, devoid of the warmth I'd loved. Around him, his team looked stunned, horrified. "The cover-up went all the way to the top," Michael explained. "Dad's unit commander was corrupt, involved in illegal arms deals. Dad had found out about it. But instead of reporting it, he tried to get a piece of the action. The raid wasn't about weapons, it was about eliminating witnesses. People who knew too much about the trafficking operation." Sarah handed me another document. When things went wrong and civilians died, his commander panicked. They fabricated the hero story to protect themselves. They said Dad died saving his team from an ambush. The truth is, one of his own men shot him. A soldier named David Chen. He couldn't live with what they'd done. He shot Dad to stop him from killing more people, then turned himself in. Chen was court-martialed in secret, Michael added. Spent 15 years in military prison for murder. He was released 5 years ago. He's the one who kept all these documents waiting for the truth to come out. Our investigator found him living in Oregon, still carrying the weight of what he'd done. I stared at my children, these bearers of unbearable truth, and felt 20 years of my life dissolve like sugar in rain. Every memorial service, every Veterans Day when I'd stood proud in the town square. Every time I'd told our children that their father was a hero of it was built on lies and blood. Did you know? Sarah's question was barely a whisper, but it cut deeper than any blade. Did you have any idea what kind of man he really was? No, I said, and it was the most honest word I'd ever spoken. I loved him. I thought I knew him. But what had I thought? 20 years dissolved in reverse through my memory. I saw Thomas with new eyes now, searching for signs I'd missed. The phone calls he'd take in another room. The way he'd sometimes look at our children with an expression I'd mistaken for love, but might have been guilt. The nightmares he'd had, that I'd attributed to the stress of service, but might have been the screams of those he'd killed. How could I have lived beside a monster and called it love? There's something else, Michael said, his voice gentler now. He pulled out a final document. Chen kept a journal. He wrote about that day. He said Dad wasn't always like that. He said something broke in him over there. The corruption, the violence. The things they saw. Chen said your husband lost himself before he lost his humanity. I read Chen's words through tears that wouldn't stop falling. Thomas Hartford was a good man who made a terrible choice, then made another and another until he couldn't find his way back. In the end, I didn't kill a monster. I killed a man who had forgotten how to be human. I think about his family sometimes, about the wife and children who'll remember him as a hero. Maybe that's the kindest lie anyone ever told. Sarah knelt beside my chair, taking my shaking hands in hers. Mom, we know this destroys everything you believed, but we thought you deserved the truth. You've spent 20 years mourning a man who never existed. I looked at my daughter's face, at my son's anguished eyes, and felt something crack open inside my chest. What do we do now? I asked. How do we live with this? We face it, Michael said firmly. Together. We acknowledge what he did. We mourn the people he killed. And we figure out how to move forward. I held the medal up to the light, this symbol of valor that represented nothing but violence and lies. The afternoon sun caught the brass, making it gleam with false nobility. Outside my window, children played in the street, their laughter carrying through the glass. Somewhere in the world there were mothers who had lost their children because of my husband's actions. Mothers who would never grow old beside their partners. Never watch their babies become adults. Part of me wanted to throw the medal away. To burn every photograph, to erase Thomas Hartford from my history and my heart. But another part, the part that had loved him truly, that had built a life around his memory, understood. Something more complicated and more painful. The man I had loved might have existed once. The father who had held our newborn children with tears in his eyes, who had danced with me in the kitchen, who had kissed my forehead and promised forever that man had been real, even if he'd been destroyed by his own choices. I need time, I told my children. I need to think about what this means, about who I've been all these years, about who I am now. They nodded, understanding in their eyes. We sat together as the afternoon light faded, 3 people trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives on the ruins of a beautiful lie. The truth, I was learning, was its own kind of death. But perhaps in time, it might also be a different kind of freedom. I thought my husband died a hero part 2. The weeks after the revelation moved like wading through deep water. Every morning I woke expecting to find it had all been a nightmare. Some cruel trick my aging mind had played. But the manila folder remained on my dining table, silent testament to the unraveling of my entire existence. I stopped going to my weekly bridge club. I couldn't bear to face Eleanor Morrison, whose son had served with Thomas, who had spent years telling me how honored she was that her boy had known such a magnificent man. I stopped attending church where Father Michael had invoked Thomas's name in sermons about sacrifice and duty. I stopped answering my phone when the Veterans Association called about their annual fundraiser. I became a ghost in my own life. Haunting rooms filled with lies. Sarah came by every other day, bringing groceries I barely touched and sitting with me in silence that felt more honest than any words we could speak. Michael threw himself into research, determined to find every victim, to understand the full scope of his father's actions. He came to me one evening with a list of names. 17 people who had died that night in a compound half a world away. Amira Hassan, age 4, he read, his voice mechanical, as if emotion would shatter him completely. Omar Hassan, age 7. Leela Hassan, age 32, their mother. Rashid Hassan, age 35, their father. A family. An entire family erased because my husband had chosen greed and violence over humanity. Stop, I whispered. But Michael continued, giving voice to every stolen life, forcing us both to bear witness. When he finished, we sat in the heavy silence of accountability, to people trying to carry a weight that could never be lifted. Only endured, it was Sarah who finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. What do we do, Mom? Do we go public? Do we tell people the truth? I thought about my small town, where Thomas Hartford was immortalized on a plaque at the town hall. I thought about the elementary school that had named their library after him, where children learned to read surrounded by the legacy of a man who had killed children just like them. I thought about my grandchildren, who wore their grandfather's name with innocent pride. If we expose him, I said slowly, we don't just destroy his memory. We destroy what people believe about heroism, about service, about trust in the systems that are supposed to protect them. But living with the lie destroys us, Sarah countered, her eyes fierce with a pain I recognized as my own. It destroys you, Mom. I watch you disappearing a little more each day, crushed under the weight of this secret. She was right. The truth was killing me as surely as any disease. But the truth would also kill so many other things, illusions that gave comfort, stories that gave meaning, a narrative that helped a community make sense of sacrifice and loss. That night, I did something I hadn't done since the revelation. I took out my wedding album, the white leather worn soft with years of touching, and I looked at the man I had married, 26 years old, with eyes that crinkled when he smiled, with hands that had held mine with such tenderness. In the photographs, we looked radiantly happy. Two people building a future on foundations of love and hope. When had it gone wrong? When had the man in these pictures transformed into the man in those terrible documents? I thought back to his deployment, to the letters he'd sent home that had gradually changed in tone. The early ones had been full of longing and love, descriptions of the people he met, the children who reminded him of Sarah and Michael. But later, letters had grown sparse, mechanical, stripped of emotion. He'd stopped talking about the people and started talking only about the mission, the objectives, the enemy. I had attributed it to the stress of war, to the natural adaptation soldiers make to survive in impossible circumstances. Now I wondered if I'd watched his humanity leak away in those letters, drop by drop, and mistaken it for strength. There was a knock at my door near midnight. I found David Chen standing on my porch, a slight man in his 50s, with eyes that held decades of sleepless nights. "Mrs. Hartford," he said quietly, "your son gave me your address. I hope you don't mind. I needed to see you." I should have been angry. This was the man who had killed my husband, regardless of the reasons. But looking at his haunted face, I felt only a terrible kinship. We were both prisoners of that night, both sentenced to carry its weight forever. "Come in," I said. We sat in my kitchen, this stranger and I, with coffee neither of us touched growing cold between us. Chun's hands trembled as he spoke, and I realized he was as terrified as I was. "I've rehearsed what I'd say to you for 15 years, he began. "In prison, lying awake, I'd imagined this conversation. But now that I'm here, all those words seem inadequate. Tell me about that night, I said. Not the official version. Not the sanitized report. Tell me what really happened. Chen closed his eyes, and I watched him step back into his nightmare. We'd been tracking the weapons smuggling for months. Your husband's commander, Colonel Brennan, was taking kickbacks to look the other way. Thomas found out. At first, he was going to report it. I remember him pacing, furious, talking about duty and honor. But then ... then what? Then Brennan offered him a cut, a substantial one. Enough to secure your family's future, he said. Enough to make sure you and the kids would never want for anything. Chen's voice cracked. Thomas struggled with it. I saw him struggle. He called you that night, do you remember? It was 3 weeks before the raid. I did remember. He'd sounded strange, distant, and when I'd asked if he was okay, he'd said, I'm just trying to figure out how to do right by you and the kids. I'd thought he meant coming home safe. Now, I understood he'd meant something else entirely. He convinced himself he was doing it for you, Chen continued. That taking the money wasn't corruption if it was for his family. The mental gymnastics people perform to justify their choices are remarkable. And once he'd made that first compromise, the next ones came easier. The raid, I prompted, though part of me wanted to stop him. To preserve what little remained of my ignorance, we thought the compound was empty. Intelligence said it had been evacuated. But intelligence was wrong. Or Brennan had lied. Or maybe Thomas just didn't care enough to verify. We went in hard and fast, and when people started screaming, when we realized there were families inside. Chen's breathing became ragged. Some of us tried to stop it. Tried to pull back. But Thomas gave the order to continue. He said we'd come too far to abort. That witnesses would destroy everything. And you shot him. I shot him, Chen confirmed, tears streaming down his weathered face. He was about to throw a grenade into a room where children were hiding. I aimed for his shoulder, tried to wound him. But my hands were shaking, and the bullet. He couldn't finish. We sat in silence. Two people connected by violence and grief. By the terrible knowledge of what one man's choices had wrought. Finally, Chen spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I need you to know something, Mrs. Hartford. In his last moments before he died, Thomas said your name. He said, tell Margaret I'm sorry. Tell her I lost myself. I never got to deliver that message. They covered it up so completely that I couldn't reach you without exposing everything. But you deserved to hear it. Those words broke something in me, some final dam I'd been maintaining. I wept. Not the quiet tears I'd shed over the past weeks, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the core of my being. I wept for the man Thomas had been, for the man he'd become, for the victims of his choices, for my children's shattered illusions, for the 17 lives stolen, and for myself, for the woman who had loved honestly and been betrayed by that love. Chen sat with me, this stranger who understood my grief better than anyone else could, and when I could finally breathe again, I asked him the question that had been forming in my heart. What do we owe them? The victims. The families who lost everything. What do we owe them? The truth, Chen said simply, and whatever reparations we can make, though nothing will ever be enough. Over the following months, I began the hardest work of my life. With Sarah and Michael beside me, with Chen's testimony and documents to support us. We started the process of setting the record straight. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no press conference, no public exposure. Instead, we reached out quietly to the families of the victims. Those we could find, and we told them the truth. We offered apologies that could never be adequate. We set up a foundation using Thomas's military benefits and life insurance. Money that had sustained me for 20 years, and dedicated it to the survivors and the families of those who had been killed. We worked with human rights organizations to pressure the military to formally acknowledge what had happened, and to reopen investigations into the corruption that had enabled it. The town learned the truth gradually, through whispers that became conversations. The library quietly removed Thomas's name. The plaque at Town Hall was taken down. Some people were angry with me for destroying a comforting lie. Others thanked me for my courage. Most simply didn't know what to say to a woman who had dismantled her own husband's legacy. Eleanor Morrison stopped speaking to me. Father Michael struggled to reconcile his sermons about my husband with the reality of his actions. My bridge club found excuses to exclude me. I understood. I had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about heroism and humanity, about how good systems can shelter evil, and about how love can blind us to the darkness in those we cherish. But there were unexpected graces too. Chen became a friend, a fellow traveler on the difficult road of accountability. Together we spoke at veterans groups about the moral injuries of war, about the importance of speaking up when conscience demands it, about the cost of compromise. My children, instead of being destroyed by their father's truth, became advocates for transparency and justice in military operations, and discovered something I hadn't expected, that living with a hard truth, however painful, was better than living with a comfortable lie. The weight of the secret had been crushing me. The weight of the truth shared and acknowledged was somehow easier to bear. On what would have been Thomas's 70th birthday, I visited the cemetery where his headstone stood. The inscription remained unchanged. Beloved husband, devoted father, honored soldier. I had chosen not to alter it. Not because he deserved those words, but because they represented what he had been before he lost himself, and what he might have remained if different choices had been made. I placed flowers on his grave, and I spoke to him as I hadn't since learning the truth. I loved you, I said to the stone. To the memory, to the ghost of the man I'd married. I loved you truly, and that love was real, even if you betrayed it. I'm choosing to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred is too heavy for me now. But I won't forget what you did. I won't allow your victims to be forgotten. This is how I honor both the man you were and the people you destroyed, by holding the truth of both without flinching. The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the oak trees that stood sentinel over the dead. I felt for the first time in months something like peace. I was 68 years old, and I had learned that love and monstrosity can coexist in the same heart, that heroes and villains are sometimes the same people viewed from different angles, that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are powerful, but the truth is more powerful still, and that there is a strange, painful freedom in acknowledging the full complexity of those we've loved, seeing them clearly in all their flawed humanity, and choosing how we will carry their memory forward. The medal sits in a box in my attic now, alongside the documents that revealed the truth. Someday, perhaps, my grandchildren will find them both and understand that their grandfather's legacy is not simple heroism or simple villainy, but something harder and more humane, a cautionary tale about how easily we can lose ourselves, and how courageously we must fight to face uncomfortable truths. As I walked away from the cemetery that day, I carried with me both grief and gratitude. Grief for what was lost and could never be recovered. Gratitude for the clarity that allowed me to finally see clearly, to choose truth over comfort, and to build what remained of my life on foundations of honesty rather than illusion. The truth had turned my husband from hero to villain in my eyes. But more importantly, it had transformed me from a keeper of lies into a bearer of truth. And in that transformation, painful as it was, I had finally found my way to something real.